In this session of $5 Fashion School, we are going to make a stitch portfolio. A stitch portfolio is a cloth record of the stitches your sewing machine can make with notes on how to make them. Stitch portfolios are a wonderful way for you to get to know your sewing machine if it's new to you, and it acts as something of a cheat sheet so that in the future, as you complete sewing projects, you can see how a particular stitch is going to look when you sew it on your machine without having to have a lot of guesswork involved. It's a great tool to have, and you'll learn a lot while making one. So what you'll need to make your stitch portfolio is a spool of all-purpose thread, a pen or a pencil, a straight edge or ruler, and I recommend cotton broadcloth, muslin, or poplin. Broadcloth, muslin, poplin, these are very stable fabrics, which are great for when you're creating a stitch portfolio. So the first thing to do is take a reasonably sizable chunk of muslin. In my case, I cut this one to about 10 inches by 10 inches. You're going to take your pencil or pen and a straight edge, and on one half of your cloth square, you're going to draw some straight lines parallel to one another. I find that between 8 and 12 lines is a good enough amount of space to complete your stitch portfolio, because it's large enough that you can make each stitch clear and distinct from other stitches that are on that piece of cloth, and it also gives you a good amount of space left over so that you can make some notes about the particular stitches that are on your portfolio page. Don't worry about getting it super perfect. The stitch portfolio is for your eyes only. You're not going to be graded on it, but do try to be fairly consistent. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and start choosing a stitch. I'm going to set my zigzag to 0, and I'm going to set my stitch length on my sewing machine to 1. On most sewing machines, on the stitch length controller, 1 is usually the smallest stitch, and 4 or 5 is going to be the longest length of stitch. So go ahead and set your cloth down and align your drawn line with the needle, and go ahead and stitch along that line. You want to, it's really more about getting a sample of the stitch, and if you stitch along the penciled lines that were drawn, you'll get the most clear appearance of that particular stitch in your stitch portfolio. When you're done sewing, always clip off the threads. So here you can see I've set my stitch length to 1. As I move forward, I'm going to move that to a stitch length of 2 for my next stitch on this page of my stitch portfolio. So I'll repeat the same thing. So I've only changed one thing, which is the length of stitch. I'm going to go ahead and align the drawn pencil line with my needle on the sewing machine. If you look at your presser foot, some presser feet actually have an etched in marking to show you where the center point is, and that center point should match up with your needle, and both of those should match up with the drawn line that you've made on your cloth. So I always just stitch to the end of the line that I drew. I drew them fairly evenly, so it's a good termination point. You can make yours longer if you'd like to. I find it's easiest if you try to keep certain things pretty even. Now, above each stitch, I've gone ahead and used a pen to mark directly on the cloth to make notes about what that particular stitch represents. In this case, it's a stitch length of 2. This is important because in the future, if I want to see, oh, well, what does a stitch length of 2 look like? It's easy for me to see what that is. So here, I'm going to go ahead and move my stitch length to a 3. And just like before, I'll find the 3rd line on my cloth, I'll align the needle, lower the presser foot, and I'm just going to go ahead and sew straight along that line all the way to the end of the line. And by the way, making a stitch portfolio is a wonderful way for you to learn what each of the features on your sewing machine does. You'll also learn how to control the fabric, and you'll also learn how to control the speed at which your sewing machine sews as you create this portfolio. So I'm going to do the last line here, so I'm going to crank it all the way to a 4. I think that's pretty much the extent of it for my machine. And I'm going to go ahead and choose that 4th line. And just as before, I line up the line that I drew with a needle and lower the presser foot and go ahead and sew straight forward. Now, if you notice as I sew, I'm not pushing the fabric along. I'm just using my fingertips to guide the fabric under the presser foot without forcing it to move any, I'm not forcing it under the machine. I'm not pushing it under the machine. So just as before, I'm going to make a note that this is a stitch length of 4. And again, this is for my future reference. The straight stitches are really straightforward, but again, this is for reference. Sometimes you're not sure how long of a stitch you need. It's good to take a look and see what your machine actually does. And like always, go ahead and clip off the little loose threads from your machine. You just want to be neat about this. So here on the front of the cloth where I've made notes, I can see and I can feel what each stitch looks like. Now, if we flip it over, you'll see the back of the stitch, and you can see the difference between a stitch length of 1, 2, 3, and 4. And on the back, since there's no writing on it, you get a very clear view of what that looks like. So now I'm going to add another part to it. I'm going to go ahead and adjust my zigzag, and I'm only going to work with the zigzags here. So I'm going to try a zigzag of 1, and I'm going to move my stitch length to 1. On this section, we're only going to look at the zigzag feature. So again, we line up our needle with the line that we've drawn on the cloth, and then just go ahead and stitch from the top of your line to the bottom of the line. And this is a zigzag stitch, so you can see how the needle goes left to right to create the zigzag pattern. Again, just guide your fabric under the presser foot. You don't need to force it, you don't need to push it, you don't need to pull it. And as always, clip the extra threads, especially when you're doing a lot of stitches on one piece of fabric, whether it's a stitch portfolio or not, always clip those extra threads. So I'm going to move my zigzag stitch from a zigzag of 1 to a zigzag of 2, and I'm going to keep the stitch length constant for this series of stitches. So you can see the needle is even more so moving left to right as I've increased the width of the zigzag. I haven't increased the stitch length, only the width of the zigzag. Again, always clip your threads. And I'm going to make another zigzag. I'm going to move my zigzag from a zigzag of 2 to a zigzag of 3. And you can see even more so, there's more variance between the left and the right. So you get a wider zigzag when you move up to a zigzag of 3. Again, with these more decorative stitches, it's good to keep the stitch length constant while you make these extra stitches. You only want to see one variable at a time. So if you're doing a decorative stitch or a series of decorative stitches, just go ahead and keep the stitch length constant, but only vary, say, the zigzag of the stitch. Or if you're using one of the more decorative stitches, you can choose your decorative stitch and the width, which for most sewing machines is also the zigzag. Keep that constant. So you need to have one constant, so it's easy to compare, your variable. In this case, the variable, it's the width of the zigzag of the stitch. So here, I'm just gonna make some notes. So with each zigzag stitch, I'll go ahead and put a note as to what number I set on the zigzag, and that number corresponds to the width. So that in the future, if I'm like, oh great, okay, I think that zigzag, width of 3 would be great for this project, you can just look at your stitch portfolio and confirm that that's the case. And when you're working with multiple variables, just note the one variable that was left constant. So here I'm going to write underneath those 4 stitches that the stitch length was a stitch length of 1 for all 4 of those stitches. Now you, with your own sewing portfolio, you can organize how you'd like to. I try to group like with like. So if I'm going to be doing zigzag stitches, I'll keep all 4 different zigzags on the same page, so to speak, of my stitch portfolio. And here we can compare. So we have a zigzag 1, we have a zigzag of 2, a zigzag of 3, and a zigzag of 4. Again, the opposite side gives you a more clear presentation of what the stitch will look like. Here's a page out of my completed stitch portfolio. So I've done here one pattern. I have this 3-part zigzag on my sewing machine, so I've allowed that pattern to go, but I've only varied the stitch length of that particular pattern. Here I've used pattern number 3, I've used a zigzag width of 4, and again, by simply modifying the stitch length, I get 4 different stitches out of that one setting. What I like are the embroidery stitches. So on my machine, it's pattern number 13. I had a stitch length of 1, and you can really see the difference between a zigzag length of 1, 2, 3, and 4. Especially once you get to 3 and 4, you can see you get more obvious, more clear kind of a wave pattern as you develop that stitch. And that's really great to know. Maybe I might be inclined to put something decorative on my fabric or create a textile. That's something that I'm going to want to see. So there you have it. Go ahead and enjoy. This is a wonderful first project for you to get to know your brand new sewing machine, and it's an incredibly useful tool. Enjoy!